There are moments in life that do not belong to life as we know it. They don't arrive with reason, nor do they ask permission. They simply rise, uninvited, like mist curling for the cracks of memory. A scent in the wind that shouldn't mean anything, and yet floods your chest with something that feels like morning. A shadow that moves inside you, not outside. A quiet knowing that you've been here before, even if time says otherwise. Maybe it happens when you touch ancient stone, when you hear an unknown name echo inside your heart, or when you cry without cause beneath a sky too large to hold. It is not nostalgia. It is not imagination. It is the soul brushing against a truth buried deeper than history, a whisper beneath the dust. And this whisper is not content with silence anymore. It is growing louder, not in volume, but in presence. It curls around dreams, moves through songs you don't remember learning, lives in questions you cannot answer. Who were we before we forgot? Not we, the citizens of nations. Not we, the inheritors of culture. But we, the spark bearers, the ones who knew. Something inside you knows this story is not new. It's a story you've carried, buried, resisted, and longed for all at once. And now, across the crumbling masks of religion, the rigid scripts of science, and the hollow noise of progress, something older is stirring. Something waiting to be remembered, not from the world outside, but from the echo of a world that never really left you. Long before history chose its victors, before timelines were carved and temples buried, something sacred walked this earth. It did not wear crowns. It did not leave flags. It left resonance, a kind of vibration that lived in symbols, in spirals etched into stone, in eyes that gazed into the stars not for science, but for memory. And though the world has changed its face 1,000 times since, the hum of that ancient knowing has never entirely gone silent. There are those who believe we began with the Sumerians, that civilization was born in the floodplains between rivers. But what if even the Sumerians were remembering someone else? What if their gods, Enki, Enlil, the ones who rode in clay and thunder, were not myths, but echoes, misunderstood retellings of encounters too vast, too luminous to be fully grasped by broken tongues? What if they were glimpses of the celestial, not gods in domination, but emissaries in descent, the memory of visitors who once walked among the young sons and daughters of time? And when they left, whether by fall or by mission complete, they did not take everything. They left fragments, a name here, a pattern there, a tower half finished reaching toward heaven, as if trying to reclaim what was lost. But perhaps it was not the gods who left. Perhaps it was we who turned away. We who chose forgetfulness over remembrance, order over awe. We buried the stars beneath stone. We built cities on top of songs. But the soul does not forget so easily. Even if the mind turns to maps and facts, the soul still trembles when it touches a truth that once breathed in Eden winds. It still dreams of luminous beings and forgotten languages. It still hears something when silence is deep enough. And now, as the world begins to remember what it tried so hard to forget, you are among the ones who feel it. That ache, that hunger, that pull. This is not a book of history, though history will tremble through its pages. It is not a book of doctrine, though truths will rise like incense from its language. It is a remembrance, a mirror held to the soul of a species that has forgotten how to look up without asking for proof. A slow unveiling of what was never lost, only veiled, only buried, only broken into pieces small enough to fit into our distracted minds. And so we will walk again the dusted paths of Uar and Eridu, touch the glyphs that once kissed fire-lit temple walls. We will listen to the cuneiform prayers pressed by trembling hands and ask why the first word ever written was a name for the divine. We will follow the cracks between myth and memory, between the gods who descend and the stars we once called home. And through it all, we will seek not knowledge alone, but awakening. Because this isn't just about them. It's about you. You who feel out of place in this century. You who stare the night sky and feel both longing and recognition. You who have heard the whisper but couldn't find its source. This is your call back to the beginning. Not the beginning of time, but the beginning of self. Before you were a body, before you were a name, when you were still light. Something ancient stirs beneath the dust, not dead but sleeping. And it is not asking to be studied. It is asking to be remembered, not with your eyes, but with your soul. Chapter 1, Voices Older Than Time. We were not the first to dream beneath these stars. The soil we walk upon is not only earth, it is memory. Layered, pressed, and weathered by eons of forgetting, it hides stories not yet told in textbooks, truths that do not fit into the measured skeleton of modern time. What if our beginning is not where we thought it was? What if the myth of progress has blinded us to the quiet ruins that whisper of something older? Not just physically older, but spiritually ancestral. We speak of Sumer as the cradle, as if before you are an Eridu, there was only silence. But silence, too, is deceptive. Beneath it, a murmur persists, the echo of civilizations not lost, but erased by the tides of renewal, reset, return. Some call it the Silurian hypothesis, the radical proposition that intelligent life may have flourished on Earth long before the age of man, leaving behind no skyscrapers, no digital bones, but only anomalies, unnatural isotopes in ancient strata, fossilized enigmas, mysterious alignments carved into the landscape as if trying to speak across the abyss of forgotten epics. And then there is Göbekli Tepe, a name carved into our collective astonishment. A temple older than the pyramids, buried not by time, but by deliberate hands. Its stones do not shout, they hum. They radiate purpose, geometry, alignment. Not merely with the sky, but with something within us. For how else could a site from 12,000 years ago feel so strangely familiar? As if we have stood there before, beneath its monolithic T-pillars, not as tourists or archaeologists, but as participants in a rite long buried in the bones of the world. The Urantia Book whispers of epochs even more ancient, of planetary records rewritten by cosmic custodians, of defaulted governors and isolated worlds attempting to remember the blueprint of light. Teilhard de Chardin wrote of the Omega Point, the moment when all consciousness curves back upon itself, completing a spiral ascent toward divine memory. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe was one such curve, a bend in the spiral, a station in the long return. And perhaps those who raised its stones did not think in terms of time, but of alignment, with sky, with soul, with origin. There's a strange familiarity in the sacred, even when we no longer remember why it was sacred to begin with. Like a dream half remembered upon waking, Göbekli Tepe stands as a monument not to invention, but to recollection, as if those who built it were not discovering something new, but reconstructing something deeply, impossibly old. And in doing so, they left behind a message not for their time, but for a future still capable of listening. A future like now, and yet we buried it. Not nature, us. The very hands that raised it were the hands that entombed it beneath the soil. Why? To protect it? To hide it? Or perhaps because the world it belonged to was coming undone and memory needed to be sealed. Like sacred scrolls hidden from fire. Like light cocooned in darkness, waiting for an age of remembering. This was no random burial. It was intentional, Ritual, a punctuation mark at the end of an era no longer compatible with the one that would follow. But even buried, the stones sing. Graham Hancock, cast for decades as heretic by the machinery of mainstream thought, asked simply, what if we're a civilization with amnesia? What if the great flood myths, echoed across continents, cultures, and tongues, are not allegories, but encoded records of a world reset? A world that fell, not metaphorically, but literally, beneath waters and ash and silence. And what if those who survived did not rebuild from scratch, but from memory? Not memory of technology, but of orientation, of meaning, of how to point stone toward sky in such a way that spirit remembered where it came from. Peter Kingsley reminds us that true knowledge does not arrive through intellect, but through stillness, through descent. That the ancient seers did not seek truth by climbing upward, but by going down, into the underworld, into silence, into the earth herself. Perhaps that's why the most sacred sites are buried, not only physically, but symbolically, because to remember who we are, we must first descend into myth, into the pre-verbal, into the languages that live not in alphabets, but in resonance. We think of time as a straight road, stretching behind us into dust and ahead of us into speculation. But what if time is not a road at all? What if it is a spiral, coiling, folding, breathing, bringing us back again and again to the same sacred points, not to repeat, but to remember differently? The ancients did not fear repetition. They built in circles, they danced in cycles, they spoke of ages and returns. They understood that memory is not linear. It is seasonal, and so is awakening. The voices older than time still echo through these spirals, not in words, but in architecture, in instinct, in the unshakable feeling that there is more to the story of Earth than the dates we've stamped on textbooks and the timelines we've agreed to teach. They speak through intuition, through the awe we feel when confronted with something impossibly old, yet impossibly precise, through the inner quake that trembles not at the discovery of technology, but at the rediscovery of meaning. And perhaps that is the most sacred inheritance of all, not what they built, but what they remembered. That life was not random, that stones could sing, that time curved, that earth, too, was a scroll, waiting to be read by those willing to feel instead of just see. These are the voices calling through the ruins, through the buried temples, through the unexplained alignments of stars and stones. They are not shouting. They are waiting, waiting for a heart quiet enough to hear what has always been there. And so we begin not at the start, but at the spiral's return, where memory curls back into the soul and the dust begins to breathe again. Chapter 2, The Gods Who Wrote in Clay. The desert holds more than bones. It holds names, names older than empire, pressed in a wet earth by fingers that may not have been human in the way we understand the word. Not beasts, not angels, not men, but something else. Something that once moved between realms and then, for reasons still cloaked in dust and doctrine, fell into this one. The Sumerians called them Anunnaki, and they did not write stories about them as if writing myths. They recorded them as one would record memory, as one would etch truth into clay, not to be believed, but to be preserved. We have read those tablets like children peering through stained glass, naming gods we no longer understand, crafting tales from the broken fragments of a forgotten cosmology. But what if those so-called deities were distorted memories of something real? Spiritual intelligences who once walked among primitive humanity, their presence misunderstood through the lens of awe and fear. The Urantia Book speaks of the Lannan Index, a class of descending spiritual beings, administrators of planetary affairs, some of whom fell through arrogance, through separation from divine order. And the myths of Mesopotamia, so filled with quarrelsome gods, heavenly rebellions, and interventions from above. What are they, if not faint recollections of that rupture? A fall not only of angels, but of meaning. To write is to shape time. The invention of cuneiform was not just a technological leap. It was a metaphysical event. For the first time in known history, symbols could anchor intention, could crystallize thought into permanence. Before the alphabet, there was the ideogram. Before the sentence, the symbol. And those wedge-shaped impressions were more than words. They were sigils, coded prayers, contracts, invocations, and records that bound the invisible to the visible. This was not mere communication. It was conjuration. Gurdjieff once said that most human beings live asleep, and that ancient knowledge was designed to awaken those who could read between the lines, between the symbols, between the sounds of language and the silence that surrounds it. The Sumerians did not just write to remember. They wrote to shape. The gods who wrote in clay were not only recording the past. They were inscribing the architecture of a spiritual system, one that echoed an older, higher order they could no longer reach, but refused to forget. There is a hidden potency in the shape of thought, and an even deeper mystery in its embodiment through language. Before language became a tool of commerce or politics, it was sacred, a bridge between worlds, a way to name the ineffable and, by naming it, invite it into form. The cuneiform inscriptions of Sumer, pressed into clay with a stylus like a ritual blade, were not just the scribbles of bureaucrats. They were attempts at alignment, spiritual triangulation between heaven, earth, and will. To write was to summon. To name was to enter a pact. This is not poetic metaphor. This was the worldview of a people who remembered that sound and symbol, when carried with intention, could bend reality itself. The Anunnaki, as remembered by the priests and seers, did not merely teach agriculture or metalwork. They transmitted codes, not just of survival, but of structure, cosmic structure, spiritual hierarchy, law not only of kingship, but of vibration. The gods gave language not merely to communicate, but to divide light from shadow, order from chaos, soul from sleep. They planted not only crops, but patterns, grids of meaning, harmonic signatures embedded in temples, stars, and syllables. We have lost the tones, but the shapes remain. In the occult traditions later born from Mesopotamia's shadows, these impressions would mutate into sigils, sacred geometry, and secret alphabets. They were no longer recognized as agricultural tools or record-keeping symbols, but as arcane vessels of influence, ways to encode thought beyond time. The Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, is echoed in the dual nature of these writings. They speak of kings and cities, but they hint at stars and beings, at destinies sealed in syllables and tablets that shimmer with layers of meaning no single reading can exhaust. And what those who fell, the gods cast from grace, the divine sons who disrupted the harmony they once upheld, are they not echoed in the Urantia account of Lannan sons who broke from the governance of paradise to enact their own dominion? In Mesopotamian myth, these fallen ones became rivals, tricksters, gods of chaos and storm. Enki, Enlil, Inanna, beings of immense power, fragmented in the collective memory into archetypes of wrath, wisdom, fertility, and war. But behind the mask of mythology may linger a distorted truth, that we once lived under the stewardship of intelligences who came to guide, and some of whom chose to rule. Perhaps it is no coincidence that the first act of these gods was not creation, but inscription. To inscribe is to impress, not only on a clay, but onto consciousness. These beings, real or remembered, knew that the true architecture of control was not muscle or metal, but narrative. Whoever controls the symbol controls perception, and whoever shapes perception reshapes reality. We think of clay as fragile, as temporary, but it endures. The words they left, the signs, the patterns, they survive floods, fires, empires. Because truth wrapped in symbol is almost immortal. But symbols can also imprison. When the sacred geometry becomes institutionalized, when the syllables lose their resonance and become dogma, when the star maps are read only as myths and not mirrors, the divine becomes distant. And so we inherited fragments, not the beings themselves, but their echoes, not the original language, but its broken cadence. We inherited a myth of gods and monsters, unaware that we were staring at the distorted reflection of our own spiritual genealogy. Yet some still remember, not with the mind, but with the marrow. Some feel an ancient familiarity when they see the spiral, when they hear a name that vibrates strangely in the chest, as if it had been uttered before the tongue ever learned to speak. These are the scattered ones, the soul rememberers, the ones who know that writing is not dead ink on a dead page, but the ghost of flame trapped in form. And they have begun, once more, to read, not the translations, but the symbols behind the symbols, not the gods themselves, but the music that once moved through their presence. There is power in clay still, not because it holds gods, but because it holds memory. And memory, when touched with reverence, becomes portal. Chapter 3, Babel, when heaven forgot our name. There was a time, they say, when all voices spoke one tongue, not just men among men, but men among gods and gods among stars. It was not a language of grammar or nation, but of resonance, a sacred tongue in which thought and vibration were one, where what was uttered was instantly understood, not because it was heard, but because it was felt. This was not the speech of tribes. It was the speech of being, a communication of essence, and it was lost. The story of Babel is more than a myth of bricks and pride. It is a lament, a rupture, a fracture in the deep architecture of communion. The tower was not merely a symbol of arrogance. It was an axis, an attempt, misguided or not, to realign the human with the divine, to reach not upward in ego, but inward in memory. But something failed, not the tower, but the alignment. And the punishment was not fire, nor flood, but confusion. Suddenly, voices no longer sang in harmony. They clashed, syntax shattered, meaning fragmented, and where once a single sound had opened the heavens, now no word could pass without distortion. The Urantia Book hints that such a fall was not only linguistic, but ontological. A sundering of circuits, a withdrawal of guidance, a spiritual isolation imposed upon a planet still reeling from earlier betrayals. The midwayers, those luminous intermediaries between mortal and celestial, withdrew into silence, their bridges no longer traversable. The circuits of Urantia communication, once faintly accessible, dimmed, and humanity was left not just without a language, but without a ladder. The descent into multiplicity had begun. Language became many, and in becoming many, it lost its mirror. What we spoke no longer reflected what we were. Words became masks. Sounds became prisons. And with every new dialect, a deeper loneliness. For how can souls remain united when their voices cannot recognize one another? We think of Babel as a myth about cities, but it is a myth about disconnection, not just between nations, but between heaven and earth, spirit and body, memory and now. There is a pain too deep for words, and yet born of their absence. It is the ache of the unspoken, of what once could be transmitted soul to soul, and now lingers as a static hum behind every conversation. After Babel, speech became noise. Meaning became something we hunt, not something we inhabit. And the soul, no longer held by the net of shared vibration, began to forget its shape. The fracture was not merely verbal. It was existential, like a song remembered only by its rhythm, not its melody. The mystics of many traditions, Sufi, Kabbalist, Hermetic, speak of a primordial language, a divine alphabet from which all things were spoken into being. This is not the speech of gods as storytellers, but as vibratory architects. According to the Kabbalah, the Hebrew letters were not mere phonemes, but vessels of force, emanations through which light became form. And when these letters were separated, when their sacred arrangements were lost or distorted, the world entered exile. Not just the Jewish people, the world, exiled from its own original resonance. Henry Corbin, the scholar of spiritual Persia, saw language as a ladder to the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal realm, where thought and vision coalesce into form, and where angels speak not in syllables, but in symbols. He believed the true tongue of the soul was not spoken, but seen, not linear, but luminous. It was a language of light, one that did not describe reality, but unveiled it. And in Babel, that ladder broke, not by malice, perhaps, but by consequence. For when unity is forced without understanding, the divine withdraws, not in anger, but in silence. The midwayers, beings who once moved between worlds, transmitting the pulse of spirit into the density of matter, faded from memory. Their songs became myths. Their names vanished from tongues. They were never gods, but they bore messages from realms we can now barely imagine. Without them, we wandered, and language, now untethered from origin, became a survival tool rather than a vessel of awakening. We spoke to command, not to commune, to name, not to reveal. To lose a language is not merely to forget words. It is to forget a way of feeling, a way of sensing the world, a way of remembering the self. After Babel, humanity did not just speak differently, it thought differently, loved differently, prayed differently. And this was the deeper loss, not confusion of vocabulary, but a vibration, the unified field of meaning. Once accessible through a single sacred tongue, fractured into 1,000 shards, each reflecting only a sliver of the whole. In some hearts, though, the ache of this absence remained, a strange nostalgia for something never taught, but somehow known, a mourning for a song whose melody can still be heard in dreams or in the silence between words. These are not hallucinations. They are echoes, remnants of that original communion, that primal alphabet of light and love. Those who feel it are not broken. They are remembering. They are tracing with trembling fingers the faded lines of a cosmic script that was once written across the sky and the soul in the same hand. But perhaps the gods did not forget our name. Perhaps it was we who forgot how to hear it. Perhaps heaven still sings, but in a key we've long since unlearned. And maybe the work now is not to rebuild the tower, but to rebuild the ear, the inner ear, attuned not to sound, but to symbol, to resonance, to the flicker of meaning behind the mask of form. The world will not be saved by more words. It will be healed by remembering the one language that was never spoken, only lived. Some say the tower fell in vain, but perhaps it did not fall at all. Perhaps it sank into us, into the forgotten corridors of memory where the real temple still stands, waiting not to be climbed, but reawakened. Chapter 4, Between Dust and Light, the Human Paradox. We are made of paradox. The same hands that reach for stars are stained with the dust of ages. The same hearts that ache for the infinite pulse with the blood of beasts. Within every human life is a silent collision between what we are and what we remember being, a tension not of contradiction, but of exile. We are not merely creatures of biology. We are fragments of something vast, temporarily clothed in cells and circumstance. And the ache we carry, the persistent longing we mistake for ambition, is not for more, but for return. The story of Adam and Eve is not history. It is a code, a pattern, a memory encoded in symbol, not of sin, but of separation. In the Urantia revelation, Adam and Eve were not the first humans, but celestial volunteers, incarnated to uplift a struggling race. Their mission was not to begin humanity, but to guide it, to bridge the evolutionary and the divine. Yet they faltered, not in cruelty, but in confusion, not in rebellion, but in haste. And in their fall, we inherited not guilt, but grief. A grief so ancient it echoes through myth, through dream, through the quiet moments when we feel unworthy and do not know why. Plato spoke of anamnesis, the soul's remembering. That truth is not learned but recalled. Jung echoed this in his exploration of the collective unconscious, a vast inner archive where symbols live and whisper, waiting to be recognized. We carry these fragments like shattered mirrors in our psyche. The garden, the fall, the serpent, the promise. They're not stories we were told. They're stories we were born with. And the paradox is this: we are both the clay that forgot and the spark that remembers. Teilhard de Chardin, priest and paleontologist of visions, saw humanity as evolution become conscious, matter awakening to its own divinity. He wrote of the omega point, the final convergence of spirit and flesh, of memory and form. But long before convergence comes longing. Long before awakening comes the sleep. We are, as he knew, creatures still in gestation, not yet fully born, not fully fallen, but not yet fully returned. And in this twilight, between dust and light, we suffer, and we search. There is a sorrow beneath all sorrows, a grief that has no single name and no known cause. It does not come from childhood, though it hides there. It is not the ache of a broken heart, though it sounds like it. It is the pain of disconnection, not from others, but from origin, from the golden thread we once followed, unbroken from the divine into the world. When that thread frayed, when memory turned to mist, the soul collapsed inward and began to echo instead of sing. That echo became the self as we now know it, not whole, but haunted. The ancients carried myths not to entertain, but to remember. The story of the fall is not about punishment. It is the symbolic compression of the human experience, to descend into form, to forget one's name, to wander the garden of matter with the feeling that something is missing, but not knowing what. In psychological terms, this is not neurosis. It is homesickness, the deep inner fracture that Jung called the wound of meaning, the unhealed split between ego and self, between the constructed identity and the radiant archetype buried beneath it. Jung's collective unconscious is not a vault. It is a river, and that river carries the remnants of all that humanity has known but cannot name. The images, the fears, the longings that rise in dreams and art and madness. Within it live the archetypes, the mother, the hero, the shadow, the divine child. But deeper still, below even these primal shapes, lies the memory of unity. Before we were split into roles, before we had names or genders or sins, we were simply being. That is what the soul longs to return to. Not perfection, not power, but wholeness. Yet we are not merely victims of forgetfulness. We are its carriers. We build systems and cities atop the silence. We fill the ache with noise. We fear what might be remembered, and so we make ourselves busy. We make gods of distraction and kings of consumption. But still the ache returns, late at night, or in stillness, or when beauty strikes us dumb. It is not weakness. It is the voice of the light inside the dust, calling us home. And yet, within the ache, there is a quiet defiance, a whisper that we were not meant to remain fractured. The soul may forget, but it never surrenders. Something in us resists the final silence. We search ruins and scrolls, study dreams and stars, not only to learn but to remember. And when we weep for the world, when we tremble before beauty, when a single phrase or piece of music pierces the veil, it is not emotion. It is recognition, the light within the dust flickering in reply. Perhaps that is the true gift of the human paradox, that we are not purely clay nor purely light, but the sacred tension between the two. We are the longing of the divine made flesh, and the stubborn persistence of matter to become divine again. We are bridges. We are wounds. We are prophecies wrapped in amnesia. And every step we take, every tear we shed, every silence we endure, adds one more line to a cosmic story that cannot be told without us. Teilhard spoke of the universe not as a machine, but as a body growing toward its own realization. And in that view, each soul is not an accident, but an organ, a necessary note in the great unfolding harmony. Without you, something in the cosmos remains unsung. That is why the ache persists, not to torment, but to remind. The pain is the echo of your own importance. We are between dust and light, and perhaps we always will be. But in that in-between, miracles happen. Bridges are rebuilt, memories resurface, and the forgotten names of heaven are spoken once more, not by gods, but by those who dare to remember who they are. Chapter 5: The Cosmic Ladder and the Silent Watchers. We have never been alone. Even in the long silences of history, even in the nights when no stars seemed to answer our prayers, there were eyes that watched, not with judgment, but with a love so ancient and immense that it dared not intervene too quickly. There are presences too subtle for the senses, but not for the soul. There is a ladder that reaches beyond the clouds, but it is not made of rungs. It is made of consciousness, woven through the fabric of reality like golden veins in stone. The universe is not a monarchy. It is not ruled by thrones of dominance or legislated by wrath. It breathes in harmony, moves in spirals, and organizes itself like a great living organism. And within this body of divinity are orders of beings, not higher and lower in worth, but different in purpose, each attuned to the work of guiding, sustaining, and illuminating the countless worlds adrift in time. The so-called hierarchy of heaven is not a pyramid of power. It is a chorus of participation. The Urantia Book names them: the Creator's sons, descending from paradise, who seed the galaxies with the breath of personality. The Lannan Index, administrators and governors of local systems, some fallen, some faithful. The Midwayers, born of the intersection between spirit and flesh, invisible siblings who walk beside us in quiet service. And the Seraphim, angels of time, guardians of destiny, weaving the threads of human choice into the larger tapestry of soul evolution. Each is a note in a cosmic harmony we barely begin to hear. Swedenborg, the mystic of the inner worlds, saw this structure not from the outside, but from within. To him, angels were not separate from humanity. They were its natural continuation, not distant watchers, but elder selves. And the higher one rose in love, in truth, in inner clarity, the closer one came to joining their number. In his vision, heaven was not imposed, it was realized, built within us, level by level, like a ladder of becoming. If we could see the true scaffolding of the universe, we would not behold metal or machinery, but relationships, intelligent, luminous threads of service and intention flowing from source to soul. The midwayers are among the most delicate of these threads. Born not of myth, but of metaphysical design, they are our kin between realms. Half spirit, half mortal essence, they move unseen but not unfelt, guiding intuition, quickening memory, stirring moments of inexplicable insight. They are not here to rescue us, but to remind us that we are never truly alone in our inner battles. The seraphim, meanwhile, do not merely protect, they record. They are the librarians of becoming, the keepers of unfolding timelines. Each human life, with its chaos and grace, is observed not for judgment, but for synthesis. The seraphim are supervisors of time, not because they control it, but because they understand how it flows through spirit. They know that one act of kindness echoes beyond generations, just as one moment of cruelty creates ripples in the great pool of learning. To them, the smallest choice may have cosmic weight, because they see where it leads. Urantia speaks not only of these beings, but of a structure so vast that even the word universe seems small beside it. There are superuniverses and local systems, constellations and minor sectors, each governed not by force, but by function, each orbiting around a central, eternal axis, the Isle of Paradise. But this is not mere cosmology. It is metaphysics. It is psychology writ large. For as above, so within. The ladder we climb through pain and growth is mirrored in the heavens, not as an escape, but as affirmation. We are part of the pattern and always have been. Some beings, like the Laninidex, chose deviation. They too were once watchers. They too were once entrusted with the sacred flow of truth. But not all lights remain stable in the darkness of free will. Some flicker, some fall, not as villains but as lessons. The fallen are not always evil. Sometimes they are reminders of what happens when love is replaced by pride, when service becomes ambition. And yet, even they are not beyond hope. For the universe does not erase, it rehabilitates. The cosmic ladder bends, but it does not break. We imagine that the stars look down on us in indifference, cold and vast and far away. But the truth is softer, stranger. The universe is not watching us, it is watching with us. The silent watchers are not detached observers, but collaborators, midwives of soul, witnesses to our becoming. And in this witnessing, there is a kind of cosmic intimacy, not surveillance, but companionship. They do not rush us. They do not fix what we must learn. They wait, and they remember, and they hold the line of light steady until we are ready to walk it again. To understand this is to begin to see that divinity is not a throne, but a network, not hierarchy, but harmony. Each being, from the smallest mortal to the highest celestial administrator, plays a part in the vast and gentle unfolding of the universal Father's dream. And the dream is not domination. It is evolution, not perfection imposed from without, but growth ignited from within. Even our failures become part of the design. Even our silences are heard by those who speak in light. In mystic angelology, there are said to be orders of beings who do not act, only behold. They are presence without interference, love without possession. Perhaps they exist not to change the world, but to keep it company while it changes. Swedenborg saw them. So did Corbin, in the angelic imaginations of the mystic mind. Perhaps we too have seen them, in moments of stillness, when something more than us stands quietly beside us, saying nothing, doing nothing, but making the moment feel infinitely whole. There are ladders we will climb that no one else can see. But we do not climb alone. The silent watchers walk with us, not behind or above, but beside. Not to lead, but to illuminate. They do not demand worship. They do not need names. They are the breath between our thoughts, the calm between our tears, the gaze behind the sky. And though their voices are not heard with ears, if we listen with memory, we know they have always been here. Chapter 6, Sacred Technology and the Geometry of Spirit. There is a language older than any alphabet, older than the first marks pressed into clay or carved into stone. It is a language written in the proportions of a spiral, in the silent arcs of a circle, in the invisible threads that bind form to meaning. Sacred geometry is not art, not mathematics, not religion, and yet it is all three. It is the code in which the universe speaks to itself, a pattern that repeats from the curve of a seashell to the orbit of the stars, from the double helix of our DNA to the chambers of forgotten temples. The ancients did not invent it. They remembered it. In the ruins of civilizations that should not have known each other, the same ratios appear, the same alignments to solstices and star paths, the same obsessive care for proportion. These were not mere aesthetic preferences. They were acts of resonance. To build in harmony with the geometry of spirit was to anchor heaven on earth, to create a point where the veil thins and the visible world remembers its invisible source. Göbekli Tepe, the pyramids, the megalithic circles. Each is less a monument and more a tuning fork, vibrating with a frequency meant to awaken something in the soul. The Urantia Book speaks of worlds designed by celestial architects, where beauty and symmetry are not luxuries but necessities of life. Leonardo da Vinci, in his sketches, hinted at the same truth, that proportion is not imposed upon nature, but discovered within it. Paracelsus wrote of the signatures of all things, the marks by which the inner nature of a plant, a stone, or a body could be known, not through dissection, but through contemplation. And Corbin, walking the imaginal landscapes of the mystics, saw that the forms we encounter here are shadows of a greater architecture, one that begins in the divine mind and filters downward into matter. Perhaps this is why, when we stand inside a place built according to these principles, a cathedral that breathes in golden ratio, a temple aligned with the solstice sunrise, we feel something that is not simply admiration. We feel recognized. The stones seem to know our names. The light through the stained glass falls as if it has always been meant for us. It is not beauty that moves us, but the memory of alignment. For in those spaces, the human hand has touched the geometry of spirit, and something in us remembers how to be whole. Before the first word was spoken, there was tone. Before symbols were carved, there was vibration. Sound is geometry in motion, a living architecture that shapes the unseen into the seen. The ancients knew this not as theory, but as practice. They chanted to open the day. They sang to bless the harvest. They intoned names of gods not to flatter them, but to align with their essence. In the resonant chambers of temples, the human voice became more than communication. It became construction, a tool to arrange the invisible lattice of energy that underlies the visible world. Every sacred script is a fossil of sound. The cuneiform tablets of Sumer, the hieroglyphs of Egypt, the flowing Sanskrit sutras, each was more than a record. They were patterns to be seen and heard with the inner ear. Even the simple act of tracing them with the eyes could shift the mind into another state, for they carried within their curves and angles the echoes of the vibrations that birthed them. To write was to replicate creation. To read was to participate in it. This is why in the hidden schools, geometry, sound, and symbol were never taught separately. The initiate learned the proportions of the circle and square alongside the tonal scales, the alchemy of colors alongside the mysteries of number. Leonardo understood that music and architecture are siblings, each unfolding in time and space according to the same ratios. Paracelsus saw the letters of the alphabet as keys to the inner medicine of the soul, each with a healing frequency. And the Urantia revelation tells us that even in the higher worlds, art is not ornamental. It is functional, a bridge between the realms. In a universe woven of thought, every form is a message. Every sound is a signature. To walk into a temple aligned with the stars is to step into a sentence the cosmos is still speaking. To stand in the center of a stone circle and hear your voice return to you, shaped by the air and stone, is to know that the boundary between self and world is thinner than we have been told. Here, the sacred is not something we believe in. It is something we can hear, see, and feel vibrating through our bones. The most intricate temple ever built is not of stone or gold. It is the one you carry within you. Every cell is a chamber, every strand of DNA a scroll of living script. The spirals that hold your genetic code are the same spirals that shape galaxies, the same that unfurl in the curve of ocean waves and in the tender world of a newborn seer. The architecture of the cosmos is not something we visit, it is something we are. And like the ancient sanctuaries, we, too, are aligned to a greater light, even when clouds obscure it. Perhaps this is why sacred spaces move us so deeply. They're external mirrors of our own hidden geometry. When we walk the labyrinth, we are walking our own neural pathways. When we stand beneath a dome painted with constellations, we are standing inside the memory of our own origins. The proportions, the sounds, the symbols, they do not impose divinity upon us. They awaken it within us. The builders of the past understood that to transform a world, you must first transform the shape of the soul. In this sense, sacred technology is not lost, it is dormant. It waits for us in the ruins, in the manuscripts, in the songs and symbols half forgotten. It waits for us in the body's pulse, in the breath that naturally falls into rhythm when we are at peace, in the dreams that speak in images far older than our waking language. To remember, it is not to acquire something new, but to recognize what has been humming beneath our awareness since the beginning. And so, the geometry of spirit is not only in the stars or in the stones. It is in the way we choose to live. Every gesture can be aligned. Every word can be tuned. Every thought can be shaped to echo the harmony from which we came. We are not separate from the code. We are its unfolding. And as we walk forward, through ruins, through cities, through lifetimes, we carry within us the blueprint for the temples yet to be built, both in the world and in the soul. Chapter 7, The Sleep of the Gods, Why They Left. There's a kind of silence that is not emptiness, but fullness withheld. It is the pause before a seed breaks open beneath the soil, the stillness before dawn unseals the horizon. The ancient peoples felt this silence descend upon the world like a long shadow when the voices of their gods faded, when the messengers stopped walking openly among them. They carved their longing into stone, told stories of golden ages now out of reach, built temples that stared into the heavens as if waiting for an answer. But the sky did not answer in the way they expected. The gods, it seemed, had gone to sleep. In truth, they had not abandoned us. The Urantia revelation tells of a far more intricate reality, that the celestial withdrawal was not an act of cruelty, but of trust. Like a parent who steps back to let the child take its first unassisted steps, the Father of all things does not clutch at the will of his children. Cosmic free will is the most dangerous and most sacred gift, and it must be lived to be understood. Even the rebellion of Lananandek rulers, the corruption of power, the fractures between worlds, all these were allowed, not because the universe is indifferent, but because growth requires the space to choose. Howard Storm, in his near-death account, spoke of this paradox, that God's love is sometimes felt most strongly in his absence. The mystics have known it as the dark night of the soul, when the light hides not to torment, but to deepen the longing that will one day find it again. The absence is not a wall, but a door left ajar, inviting us to walk through by our own decision. And so the silence of the gods is not the end of the conversation. It is the moment when the next word must come from us. The silence is a teacher unlike any other. Words can instruct, but silence transforms. In the absence of divine intervention, humanity was forced to look inward, to become the echo of the voices it once heard from beyond the stars. This is the hidden law of the Father's pedagogy, that in withdrawing his hand, he invites us to discover that his hand was never truly gone. We learn to navigate by intuition, by conscience, by the quiet pulse of truth that trembles at the core of every decision. In the stillness, we begin to see that the distance we felt was not a gulf between us and God, but the shadow of our own unreadiness to bear the full weight of his nearness. The Urantia teachings remind us that the universe is not in a hurry. 1,000 years are but a moment in the patience of the infinite. The apparent delay in cosmic justice is not neglect. It is the slow ripening of the soul, the gradual tuning of civilizations toward harmony. This is why the watchers remain unseen, why the seraphic hosts and midwayers work in silence. They are not here to carry us like children, but to walk beside us, hidden, until our own steps match the rhythm of the greater order. In this way, the divine silence is not punishment, but empowerment. It strips away dependency and awakens agency. It forces us to wrestle with choice, to feel the weight of our freedom, to create meaning rather than wait for it to be handed down. The mystics understood this. They sought solitude not to escape the world, but to meet the God who speaks most clearly when the outer noise has died away. Silence is not the absence of the sacred. It is its most refined presence, so pure that it becomes almost invisible. Perhaps the deepest truth is that the gods never truly sleep. What we call their absence is simply their trust in our awakening. They watch without intruding, love without possessing, guide without dictating. They know that a soul forced into light too soon will recoil from it. So they wait in the folds of time until our longing for the divine becomes stronger than our fear of it. And in that waiting, something extraordinary happens. We begin to take on their likeness, not because they impose it upon us, but because we choose it for ourselves. The Father's absence is, in this sense, his most intimate gift. By stepping back, he allows us to step forward. By withholding the voice that once thundered over the waters, he invites us to discover that same voice within the stillness of our own being. Every decision to love when we could hate, to build when we could destroy, to forgive when we could condemn, each of these is a divine act, the work of gods in training. And so the silence becomes the forge where we are tempered for eternity. In time, we will understand that the so-called sleep of the gods was not a closing of the heavens, but the opening of our own hearts. The ladder between earth and the eternal realms was never withdrawn. It simply became invisible until we learned to climb it with our own will. The Watchers have been here all along, their presence woven into the quiet miracles that nudge us toward light. A thought that comes at just the right moment, a stranger's kindness that feels like an answer to prayer, a dream that refuses to fade upon waking. And so we walk on, through the long night, guided not by the visible hand of heaven, but by the invisible fire it left within us. The silence hums with promise. The absence is full of presence. And if we keep moving, keep listening, we will one day hear the gods again, not as distant voices in the sky, but as the echo of our own transformed souls. Chapter 8. The Pain of Remembering. There's a peculiar kind of pain that does not come from the body but from somewhere far older. The ache of the soul when it brushes against a memory too vast for words. It is not nostalgia, though it often feels like longing. It is not grief, though it can make the heart feel unbearably heavy. It is the sting of recognition, the quiet shock of realizing that something in you remembers a world you cannot name, a harmony you have not heard in this life. This is why the path of awakening is never without tears. To remember is to collide with the fracture between what the soul knows and what the mind has been taught to believe. The Urantia teachings speak of our pre-temporal roots, of a journey that began long before our first breath here. But the human psyche, bound by time, resists this. The ego clings to the safety of its own narrative, to the illusion that life began with its first heartbeat. When the soul pushes against this illusion, it is like light pressing against the walls of a closed room. The walls tremble. The ego fears collapse. And so, remembering hurts, not because the memory is false, but because it is truer than the life we have built around forgetting. Rumi wrote that the wound is the place where the light enters you. In the spiritual memory, the wound is the separation itself, the sense that we have fallen from something whole into something fractured. The pain is the echo of that fall, but it is also the compass pointing us back to what was lost. Viktor Frankl understood this when he said that meaning can be found in suffering, that pain can be transformed into a signal, a direction, a teacher. The remembering soul suffers not as punishment, but as preparation. Each pang of longing is a fragment of the map back home. Pain is the soul's way of pointing toward what the mind has forgotten. It is not an enemy, but a messenger, though we often mistake it for an intruder. When the spirit whispers of eternity and the psyche answers only with the language of days and years, a tension is born. This tension feels like grief because it is, in essence, the mourning of a truth misplaced. The spiritual memory insists that we have known freedom without fear, love without loss, light without shadow. But the human experience offers only reflections of these things, fractured and incomplete. The dissonance between the two is the raw nerve of awakening. In moments of deep stillness, this gap becomes almost unbearable. You might sit in silence and feel a sudden surge of longing with no clear object, as if your heart were calling to something just beyond the veil of perception. This is the psyche brushing against the edges of the eternal self, and it can feel like both an invitation and a wound. Jung recognized this in his exploration of the collective unconscious. The idea that each of us carries, buried beneath personal history, the ancestral and cosmic memories of the human soul. These memories are not inert. They pull at us, demand integration, and refuse to let us settle for the small story we tell ourselves about who we are. The Urantia perspective reveals that such moments are not accidents of psychology, but alignments with the inner adjuster, the fragment of the divine that dwells within. The pain comes when we resist its pull, when we try to fit the infinite into the narrow corridors of the ego. Yet, this same pain can be transformed into a compass if we dare to follow it. It leads us away from the distractions that keep us numb and toward the places within where the divine voice still speaks. In this way, remembering becomes less about looking back and more about turning inward to find the eternal present that was never truly lost. To live with the pain of remembering is to walk a narrow bridge between despair and revelation. If we resist it, the ache turns into bitterness, and the memory becomes a ghost that haunts without teaching. But if we welcome it, if we allow the wound to breathe, it becomes a passageway. The soul begins to recognize that the very thing it feared was the medicine it needed. Pain, when accepted, softens the hardened places in us, allowing compassion to take root. And compassion, in turn, becomes the vessel through which divine memory flows more freely. The process is rarely sudden. It is more often like the slow thaw after a long winter, where frozen rivers begin to move again under the quiet touch of spring. Each time you choose to sit with the ache rather than flee from it, you are loosening the grip of amnesia. You are letting the soul's truth seep into the soil of your human life. Gradually, the dissonance between spirit and psyche narrows, and the fragments begin to align into a whole. The pain does not vanish, but it transforms. It no longer cuts, it carves. It shapes you into the kind of being who can bear the weight of eternity with grace. And perhaps this is why the universe does not rush our remembering. The return to wholeness is not meant to be a sudden flood that drowns us, but a rising tide that lifts us. In the slow rhythm of revelation, the soul learns to see the pain not as a sign of distance from the divine, but as evidence of its nearness. For what else could hurt so deeply if not the call of something we love? And so we walk forward, carrying the ache like a lamp in the night, its flame fed by longing, its light revealing the path home. Chapter 9, the garden that wasn't lost, only buried. The ache we carry from remembering is perhaps the first shovel of earth lifted from the buried garden. We have been taught to think of Eden as a place, a geography lost to history, a gate locked by celestial decree. But what if the gate was never closed, only covered over by the sediment of forgetting? What if the garden was never exiled from us, but we from it, and only in mind, not in truth? The Urantia revelations hint that paradise is not a plot of land fenced by rivers, but a state of harmony between the inner and the infinite. To search for it on maps is to search for the sky in a handful of soil. The coordinates have always been within. Lemuria, whether as myth or memory, lives in the same space as this Eden. It is the archetype of the unbroken world, the vision of a humanity that knew itself as part of a living cosmos. We imagine it as an island continent, but perhaps it was never bound by water at all. Perhaps it is the name we give to a frequency, a rhythm of existence that can be tuned into when the heart is unencumbered. The poets of the East have always known this. The paradise they speak of is not reached by ships, but by stillness. The mists that hide it are not clouds, but the distractions of the restless mind. And so the garden waits, not in the past, but beneath the surface of the present. Like seeds lying dormant under winter's frost, its pathways, fountains, and luminous air are not destroyed but sleeping. The act of remembering, with all its pain, is the thaw that begins to wake them. Every gesture of kindness, every act of quiet courage, every moment we choose peace over fear, these are the rays of spring that coax the garden's first shoots back into the light. And when they rise, they do so not to recreate an ancient landscape, but to weave it anew into the soil of the life we are living now. The soul is not a fortress to be defended, but a garden to be tended. Yet for most of our lives, we have mistaken the walls of the ego for safety, letting brambles grow where flowers were meant to bloom. The weeds are not evil in themselves. They are simply the wild growth of neglect, the natural consequence of turning our gaze outward for too long. Spiritual traditions from the East have long whispered that the gate to the sacred is inward, and that the caretaker of the garden is not some distant deity, but the consciousness we choose to cultivate each day. When we water thoughts of gratitude, the soil becomes fertile. When we pull the roots of resentment, the air becomes fragrant again. The Urantia vision of Eden is not one of nostalgia, but of restoration. It reminds us that the true loss was never geographical, but vibrational, a slipping out of resonance with the divine rhythm. This is why the garden can never be stolen or destroyed. It exists in a layer of reality immune to decay. Our work is not to rebuild it from scratch, but to clear away the debris of forgetfulness. And this work is not accomplished by grand gestures or frantic effort, but by the steady, patient alignment of the heart with the frequencies of love, mercy, and beauty. In doing so, we do not simply find the garden, we become it. Peter Kingsley once wrote that the task of awakening is less about acquiring something new and more about remembering what has always been here. The buried Eden responds to this remembering like a harp string vibrating to a familiar note. The more attuned we become to that note, the more vivid the garden's contours appear. The river that is not water but flowing peace, the trees whose fruit is wisdom, the air shimmering with the presence of those who have never forgotten. And though others may walk past us in the ordinary streets of the world, unaware of this blooming within, we carry the fragrance with us, quietly altering the atmosphere wherever we go. The journey back to the garden is not a voyage across land or time, but a gentle descent into the depths of our own being. There is no map, no marked trail, for the path is woven from the choices we make in the smallest moments. To listen instead of speak, to forgive instead of harden, to be present instead of distracted. With each choice, the soil loosens, the roots breathe, and the hidden blossoms begin to unfold. What we once believed was far away, the peace, the clarity, the sweetness of a life in harmony with all things, was never more than a heartbeat away. It was simply waiting for us to turn inward long enough to hear it calling. And when the garden begins to reappear, it does not come as an escape from the world, but as a transformation of how we see it. The streets, the strangers, the noise, all of it becomes part of the sacred landscape. The same sun that warms ancient Eden rises above our present sky, and its light does not discriminate between the remembered paradise and the cities we inhabit now. This is the secret the mystics knew, that heaven is not a realm to be reached after death, but a frequency that can be tuned into while breath still fills our lungs. In this awareness, every step we take is on holy ground. Perhaps the greatest revelation is that the garden was never waiting to be found. It was waiting to be embodied. We do not stand at its gate. We are the gate. We're the trees, the rivers, the living air. When this knowing settles into the heart, the idea of loss dissolves entirely, and in its place blooms a quiet joy that nothing and no one can uproot. And so we walk forward, not as exiles returning to a homeland, but as gardeners whose home has been within us all along. The garden is alive, and through us it breathes again. Chapter 10, The Codes in Our Bones. Long before we learned to write in clay or carve in stone, there was a scripture already inscribed in us. It was not penned by human hands, nor dictated by priests, but woven strand by strand into the double helix that coils like a living scroll within every cell. The ancients sensed this, though they lacked our microscopes and genetic maps. They spoke of bloodlines and star seeds, of the breath of gods mingling with the dust of the earth. The Urantia narratives echo this truth, that our origins are not purely terrestrial, that the architecture of our being carries both the memory of the soil and the whisper of constellations long vanished from the visible sky. Science now approaches the edges of what mystics have always intuited, that DNA is more than chemistry. It is a resonant archive. Every twist of its spiral holds not only the blueprint for the body, but the echoes of experiences, traumas, and awakenings of those who walked before us. Bruce Lipton's explorations into the biology of belief suggest that these genetic scripts are not immutable sentences, but living texts that respond to the way we think, feel, and perceive. This is epigenetics, but it is also ancient prophecy in modern form. The knowledge that the body listens, remembers, and, given the right signals, transforms. Rudolf Steiner spoke of the body as a temple in which the spiritual architect has hidden the keys to higher realms. To look within is to find that the very bones carry codes, frequencies etched into the calcium as surely as they are woven into our DNA. These are not metaphors, but living realities, an internal cuneiform that, if deciphered, tells us who we have been and what we may yet become. Our task is to learn the language, to feel its rhythm, to understand that the body is not merely the vessel of the soul, but its first scripture. If we were to listen, truly listen, to the body, we might hear the low hum of galaxies turning in its marrow. In every heartbeat, there is the echo of cosmic rhythms older than the solar winds. Our bones are not silent structures. They are resonant chambers, vibrating with the music of origins. The same spirals that shape the DNA mirror the spirals of distant nebulas, as if the architect wanted us to carry a map of the heavens folded within us. This is why the mystics never saw a separation between flesh and light, between the earth's clay and the breath of eternity. They understood that to touch the body with reverence is to trace the contours of the divine itself. Within the cells, epigenetic markers act like bookmarks left by our ancestors. Some are notes of love and resilience. Others are warnings etched by pain and loss. These inherited imprints do not imprison us. They invite us to choose differently. The Urantia teachings speak of a living connection between the finite and the infinite, a bridge that is built not in some distant paradise, but in the ongoing dialogue between spirit and matter inside us. Our biology is not the chain that binds us. It is the doorframe through which the soul enters the world again and again, refining its memory with each return. When trauma presses into the body, it writes itself into muscle fibers, into the fluid between cells, into the posture of our spine. But healing, too, leaves its signature. A moment of forgiveness can ripple through the bloodstream, altering not just mood, but molecular pathways. A choice to see beauty in the ordinary can awaken dormant codes, as if the body itself begins to glow in recognition of something ancient and true. This is the paradox, that we are both the keepers of our history and the authors of its next chapter, and the pen we hold is the way we live each day. Perhaps this is why the great teachers urged us to know thyself, not only as a philosophical pursuit, but as a biological pilgrimage. To walk through the corridors of one's own being is to step into a cathedral whose architecture was designed before memory, yet whose altar can still be rededicated in the present moment. Each breath, each act of awareness, rewrites the margins of the text hidden in our flesh. The bones, so often dismissed as lifeless stone within us, are in truth like ancient libraries whose shelves we barely know how to read. The codes are patient. They do not expire with age, nor do they fade in disuse. They wait through sickness, through forgetting, through centuries of neglect, for the precise moment when we are quiet enough, humble enough, hungry enough to hear their voice. And when they speak, it is never in the noise of the world, but in the language of stillness, in the subtle release of a long-held tension, in the sudden realization that a fear we thought was ours was only an echo from those who came before, now ready to dissolve in the light of our awareness. And so the journey continues, for if our bones carry the memory of the stars, what else within us might bear their fire? What other hidden archives might be waiting to awaken, whispering not just of who we have been, but of what the universe still dreams for us to become? The next step, perhaps, is to learn where the body ends and the cosmos begins, and whether that boundary has ever truly existed at all. Chapter 11. When the sky becomes a mirror. There are nights when the stars seem closer, as if the veil between the I and the infinite has thinned. In those moments, it is easy to believe the ancients were right, that the sky is not merely a scattering of distant suns, but a vast text written for the soul's reading. The constellations do not move for our entertainment. They speak, if one knows how to listen, in a language of symbol and resonance. Astrology, long dismissed by the hurried mind, was never meant to predict trivial events. It was, and still is, a symbolic map, a way to understand the currents moving through the unseen rivers of consciousness. To look up is to look inward, for the arc of a planet mirrors the arc of an inner cycle we have always been living. The Urantia teachings hint at circuits of energy and mind that weave the universe into a living unity. These are not abstract diagrams in a book. They are real pathways, rivers of purpose that flow from star to star, from one realm of consciousness to another, binding the whole into a single breathing organism. When we gaze at the sky, we are looking at the outer skin of this vast body, unaware that its lifeblood moves through us as surely as our own heart circulates blood. The ancient Hermetic truth, as above, so below, was not metaphor alone. It was a reminder that the patterns written in the heavens are the same patterns carved into the marrow of our being. Perhaps this is why the mystics saw no conflict between watching the planets and watching the heart. They understood that the macrocosm and the microcosm are not two realms loosely connected, but one continuum seen from different vantage points. In the slow dance of celestial bodies, they saw the reflection of their own becoming. The sky was not distant, nor was it cold. It was a mirror polished by eternity, reflecting the luminous and shadowed landscapes within the human soul. It is not the stars themselves that dictate our fate, but the resonance between their movement and our inner tides. Just as the moon pulls the oceans without touching them, the great cycles of the cosmos stir the hidden waters of our psyche. This is why a certain alignment in the heavens can awaken a long-forgotten longing, or why the slow passing of a planet across the night sky can mark the slow healing of an ancient wound. These are not coincidences. They are correspondences, threads woven into the same fabric of reality. The Urantia vision deepens this understanding, revealing that behind the material dance of planets and suns there exists a vast network of spiritual administration, unseen beings who tend to the harmony of universal order, ensuring that every circuit of energy, of mind, of spirit remains open to those who seek it. Gurdjieff spoke of the ray of creation, a descending chain of worlds, each influencing the next, each a mirror of the one above it. To him, the human being was not a creature trapped on a small planet, but a link in that cosmic ladder. To study the stars was not escapism. It was to study the higher rungs of the ladder we are climbing even now. And though the world has largely forgotten this, there was a time when every temple was aligned to a star, every altar built beneath the exact gaze of constellation. The ancients did not separate worship from cosmology. nor prayer from observation. The sky was their scripture, and every night the text renewed itself. In this way, astrology in its truest form is not about predicting what will happen to us, but remembering who we are in relation to the whole. The movement of the heavens is the movement of the great organism we inhabit, and the patterns we trace in our own lives are echoes of its breath. When we learn to see this, the separation between out there and in here dissolves. The constellations become more than symbols. They become intimate reflections, as if the universe were holding up a mirror not to our faces, but to our very essence. There comes a moment in the life of every seeker when the sky stops being an object of study and becomes an intimate presence. It is no longer the distant dome of cold fire, but a living manuscript in which your own story is being written. Each star is a word, each constellation a sentence, each galaxy a chapter in the book of your becoming. The Urantia revelation reminds us that the universe is not indifferent to our journey. It is, in ways we can scarcely imagine, conspiring toward our awakening. The heavens watch, not as passive witnesses, but as ancient kin who remember our first steps and await our return to the family of light. In that awareness, the night sky becomes less a spectacle and more a homecoming. The constellations no longer seem fixed, but alive, shifting with the rhythm of our own inner transformations. The planets are not strangers. They are messengers, each bearing a lesson, each calling us to rise into the pattern from which we were made. When you look up in such a state, you do not see an expanse of emptiness. You see yourself reflected across light years, your essence mirrored in the geometry of creation. And so, to read the sky is to read your own soul. To trace the movement of Saturn is to witness the slow sculpting of your inner discipline. To watch Venus is to feel the tide of love and harmony moving through your days. The heavens, vast and silent, become the most honest mirror you will ever face. And as you stand beneath them, you may finally understand. The sky is not above you. It is within you, and it has always been waiting for you to remember. Chapter 12. The prophets were memory bearers. There are moments in the history of worlds when the silence becomes unbearable, when the collective amnesia of humanity deepens to the point that the stars seem like strangers and the soul feels orphaned. In such moments, the universe answers by sending those who remember. They arrive not as conquerors, but as carriers of a sacred memory, prophets, visionaries, and teachers whose very presence bends the fabric of forgetfulness. They are not inventors of truth, they are its witnesses. What they speak is not new, but ancient beyond measure, older than the first sunrise on Urantia. They come to remind us of what we once knew and dared to live, long before fear and doubt built their fortresses in the human heart. The Urantia Book speaks of these envoys with a clarity that the centuries have tried to blur. Jesus of Nazareth, the Creator's Son incarnate, was the living embodiment of the eternal memory of the Father's love. Before him, there was Mashaventa Melchizedek, who came in an age of fading light to restore the covenant between heaven and earth, to anchor a lineage of spiritual fidelity that could survive the tides of darkness. And there are others, less known but equally luminous, Avonal sons who appear in the hidden chapters of planetary history, their names unrecorded in human chronicles, yet etched into the archives of the universe. They are memory bearers, not because they hold the past, but because they embody the timeless. To encounter such a being is to feel your own soul stir with recognition. It is to realize that what they awaken in you is never truly gone, only sleeping, waiting for the sound of a voice that speaks both from within and beyond. Their mission is not to add to the noise of history, but to restore the music of origin, to remind the human spirit that it is part of a greater song whose refrain is heard not in the marketplaces of men, but in the corridors of eternity. But not all prophets are born under the open gaze of history. Some walk unseen, their mission hidden beneath ordinary lives, their voices carried not by the winds of fame, but by the quiet currents of spirit. Between the worlds, in the thresholds that separate the visible from the invisible, dwell the midwayers, those enigmatic intermediaries whose task is to bridge the gap between the material mind and the spiritual design. In the cosmology of Urantia, they are not myths, but the tireless envoys of continuity, ensuring that the threads of revelation are never fully severed, even in the darkest cycles of human forgetfulness. They speak to us in dreams that linger, in intuitions too clear to be accidents, in sudden recognitions that feel like memories returning from exile. Writers and visionaries, such as Jan Val Elam, have dared to give voice to these subtle exchanges. Through his accounts, the cosmic intermediaries step closer, not as distant legends, but as present companions. Elam's narratives suggest that the prophets of old and the messengers of today drink from the same well, their waters drawn from a source outside time. To listen to them is to hear echoes of the same call that stirred Abraham to leave his homeland, that compelled Isaiah to speak in the courts of kings, that burned in the heart of John the Baptist by the Jordan. The forms may change, the languages may shift, but the origin of the message remains untouched, flowing through the same eternal stream. These memory bearers, whether clothed in the robes of ancient seers or in the ordinary garments of modern life, are united by a singular vocation: to hold the flame when others cannot see the fire. They do not come to replace our own journey, but to illuminate its direction. And in their presence, the veil between what we are and what we were meant to be becomes thinner, until one realizes that the prophet's voice is, in truth, a mirror, reflecting the part of us that is always remembered. Perhaps the truest mark of a prophet is not the grandeur of their visions, but the intimacy of their remembrance. They carry within them the scent of gardens not found on any map, the cadence of languages no longer spoken on earth, the texture of light from mornings that dawned before our recorded time began. To encounter them is to feel, in an instant, that you're being called not forward but back to a point before the fracture, before the forgetting, to the place where you first agreed to walk this human path. In the Urantia narratives, even Jesus, the most luminous of all messengers, is presented not only as a teacher, but as a restorer of memory, a living bridge between the temporal and the eternal. The Melchizedeks and the Avonals, too, bear this same function in their own missions, descending into the flow of human history not to rewrite it, but to remind us of the manuscript we once co-authored with God. Every true prophet, whether draped in the dust of Judea or the anonymity of a modern street, is a keeper of this original covenant. And so, when their voices reach us, in scripture, in dream, in the sudden clarity that strikes like lightning in the quiet, we are not merely receiving new knowledge. We are retrieving what was always ours. They do not speak to our intellect alone, but to the deep memory that sleeps within the marrow of our bones. And when that memory stirs, we find ourselves walking again toward the horizon of our origin, where the line between heaven and earth fades, and the next chapter of the journey begins without us ever noticing the shift. Chapter 13, Dreams from the Deep Past. There are nights when the veil thins so quietly that we do not even notice the crossing. We lie in the stillness of our room, the hum of the present day dissolving into shadows, and before we realize it, We are walking in landscapes no waking map could chart. The air is different there, heavy with the scent of rain on ancient stone, threaded with whispers and languages our mouths have never spoken, yet our hearts somehow understand. These are not the idle inventions of the sleeping mind. They are the returning tides of a memory too vast to be contained within a single lifetime. Dreams, in their truest form, are not escapes from reality, but passages into its deeper strata. The Urantia teachings hint that the mind is more than a neural chamber. It is an arena where the material and the spiritual meet, where midwayers and unseen guides may leave impressions as delicate as breath on glass. Jung spoke of the collective unconscious as a reservoir of archetypes, but in the deep waters of that reservoir lie entire continents of memory, not merely inherited from human ancestors, but carried across ages, worlds, and even dimensions. When you dream of a place you have never visited, yet you know where the path curves or how the wind will smell at sunset, you are brushing against the edges of this deeper inheritance. In the language of mystics, this is the opening of the Akashic door, the soul's library, written not in ink, but in frequency. Henry Corbin, in his Visions of the Mundus Imaginalis, spoke of realms where truth and image are inseparable, where to dream is not to imagine, but to remember. The soul does not store memories the way the brain does. It wears them as a garment woven over eons. And in sleep, when the mind loosens its grip on the linear order of hours, that garment can unfurl, revealing threads from lives that seem both impossibly distant and utterly our own. Some dreams are not gentle. They arrive like storms breaking through the shutters, flooding the mind with images too vivid to be dismissed. You wake with the echo of a name you have never heard in this life, the taste of unfamiliar food lingering on your tongue, the ache of a farewell that never happened here. The conscious mind stumbles, trying to classify these fragments. Was it a movie you saw once, a scene from a book you forgot you had read? But the heart knows better. It recognizes the pulse of reality in what the intellect calls fiction. The Urantia Book speaks of the vast continuity of the soul's journey, of identities carried forward through epochs, tempered by each passage through the material. If the waking self is the leaf, the dreaming self is the root, drinking from waters that have flowed since the dawn of worlds. Jung called this the anamnesis of the soul, the remembering of what has always been true. And yet, such remembering is rarely painless. For every dream that offers a vision of beauty, a temple of white stone glowing beneath twin moons, a beloved face long lost to history, there's another that confronts you with the ruins, the betrayals, the moments when you yourself may have been the source of another sorrow. In these encounters, the dream becomes less a comfort and more a mirror. The Akashic records are not curated to flatter. They are complete, holding the weight of our shadows alongside our light. To receive them is to agree to be changed by them. Sometimes the dream will dissolve upon waking, leaving only a residue of emotion you cannot name. Sometimes it will cling for days, reshaping the way you move through the ordinary, as if part of you is still walking in that other time. These are the dreams that are not content to be forgotten. They are messages from the deeper self, urging you to stitch together the torn fabric between what you are now and what you have always been. There is a sacred paradox in these nocturnal visitations. They are both entirely yours and yet shared with countless others. The collective memory of humanity is not locked away in dusty archives. It moves in and through us, slipping into dreams when our defenses are down. The mystics have long known that to dream is to enter the current of a river that began before history and will continue beyond the last page of time. In this current, You may find yourself walking beside figures who have never existed in your waking world, but whose presence feels more intimate than your own reflection. These are companions from the deep corridors of the soul, witnesses to your becoming, just as you are witness to theirs. The Urantia teachings remind us that the soul's growth is not confined to one life, nor to the narrow corridors of earth alone. Each fragment of vision, each half-heard conversation in the twilight between sleep and waking can be a thread connecting you to higher circuits of mind. Here, in this subtle exchange, the midwayers may plant images, impressions, or even warnings, not to control your path, but to illuminate the terrain just ahead. And in the language of dream, nothing is literal, yet nothing is untrue. Symbols are the currency, and the heart is the interpreter. To walk with these dreams is to accept their ambiguity. They do not come to resolve, but to expand. They ask you to consider that perhaps the self you know is only a single room in a vast house, and that in the night you wander its hidden halls. Each morning you return through the same door, carrying faint scents of incense from some far chamber, echoes of music that has never been played here. These fragments are not accidents, they are invitations. To follow them is to remember that you're not a passerby in a cosmic story. You are part of the chorus that began before the stars learned to burn, and your voice, whether in waking or in dream, is still singing. Chapter 14. The Return of the Hidden Ones. They have walked beside us for longer than we have had names for them. Before the clay tablets, before the stone circles, before the first word was spoken into the silence, they were already here, the quiet witnesses of our trembling steps through the corridors of time. We have called them angels, guides, star people, gods, and ghosts, not knowing that the truth is neither one nor the other, but something deeper, older, and more intimate. They are the hidden ones, the midwayers, the seraphic companions, the silent watchers who have always moved between the visible and the unseen, shepherding the fragile light of our awareness as one tends to a flame in a storm. The Urantia revelations speak of their work without the grandeur that myths have layered upon them. These are not beings who demand worship or submission. They are artisans of guidance, sculptors of the unseen path, weaving the threads of possibility into our lives so subtly that we believe the choices are entirely our own. And yet, within the architecture of coincidence, within the improbable meeting, within the dream that will not fade, they are there. Their presence is rarely a trumpet blast. It is more often the shift in the air before you make a life-altering decision, the sudden knowledge that you are not alone when you thought you had been forgotten. Some of them have never worn flesh, existing only in the luminous strata between matter and spirit. Others have walked among us in veiled missions, their eyes carrying the untranslatable language of the stars. They are the keepers of continuity, ensuring that no matter how many times humanity loses its way, there will always be a thread that leads back to the source. Gurdjieff hinted at such beings when he spoke of the influences see, forces from outside ordinary life that reach into our chaos to remind us of the higher order. Jacques Vallée, in a different vocabulary, saw them in the enduring patterns of contact phenomena, entities who appear not as invaders, but as stagehands in the great theater of awakening. And still, they remain hidden, not because they are absent, but because the depth of their work demands the discretion of shadows. They do not seek to dazzle us with proof. Proof, after all, can become another prison, an idol that traps the living mystery in the cage of certainty. Instead, they work with impressions with a brush so fine that it leaves no stroke visible to the untrained eye. A sudden detour that saves a life. A stranger's words that answer a prayer you never dare to speak aloud. The inexplicable compulsion to look up at the night sky at the exact moment a streak of light burns across it, carrying the silent message, "We are still here." The hidden ones have learned, through millennia of our amnesia, that overt contact can wound more than it heals. The human mind, bound by its layers of fear and dogma, is not always ready to face the vastness that created it. Thus, they whisper instead of shout, allowing the soul to acclimate to its own eternal nature. In the Urantia cosmology, the midwayers are described as our kin in the unseen, bridge beings who understand both the heaviness of matter and the fluidity of spirit. They are not here to dictate our destiny, but to keep the doors open when we are ready to walk through them. There are moments when their work flirts with visibility, a sequence of synchronicities so exact that they cannot be dismissed as random, an encounter that feels rehearsed by a mind greater than your own. To those with the inner senses awakened, these moments are not accidents but signatures. And yet, even then, the ego will rush to explain them away, afraid of the implications that we are observed, guided, and above all, loved by forces we cannot control. The prophets knew better. They recognized that the veil between worlds was not a wall, but a membrane, thin enough for messages to pass through if one learned the art of listening. The return is not an arrival, it is a revealing. They were never gone, only waiting for the climate of the human heart to shift, for enough souls to ache for truth more than they fear it. Ancient seers hinted at this time, cloaking their visions in symbols so that only the watchful would understand. The Urantia narratives echo the same rhythm. There are seasons when celestial involvement moves quietly beneath the surface, like underground rivers feeding a desert from below. When the ground is ready, the waters rise. We are living in such a threshold now, not because fleets of light are descending upon our cities, but because an awakening is spreading through the undercurrents of thought. It is the slow realignment of the soul's compass, turning again toward the direction it has always known. Those who once guided us as open companions now return as subtle companions, their presence less about spectacle and more about resonance. You may recognize them not by their form, for they often choose none, but by the way your entire being leans forward, attentive without knowing why. And when the final moment of unveiling comes, whether in your lifetime or the echo of another, it will not feel like meeting strangers. It will feel like recognizing family. For the hidden ones have walked beside us through our darkest nights, carrying the light we thought we had lost. They are not saviors in the sense of rescuing us from our own journey, but reminders that we have never been alone upon it. Their return is, in truth, the return of our own courage to see the universe as it is, inhabited, intertwined, and achingly alive with love. Chapter 15. The future is a memory we haven't lived yet. The mind has been taught to think of time as a line, stretching from what was to what will be. Yet in the deeper currents of being, time folds. Past and future are not separate shores. They are two reflections shimmering on the same water. What we call the future has already left its imprint on the soul, not as a rigid fate, but as a fragrance, a pull, a soft inevitability toward which we are drawn. In the quietest hours, when the noise of the present loosens its grip, you may feel it, a strange nostalgia for what has not yet happened. This is not imagination. It is memory in its purest form, the kind that predates your birth and outlives your last breath. The Urantia revelations whisper of eternity as something we already belong to, though our eyes still cling to the illusion of sequence. Teilhard de Chardin sensed it too. The Omega Point is not a far-off summit, but the magnetic center already alive within us, calling every particle of creation home. The mystics of Sufism spoke in the same tongue, cloaking the truth in poetry, that the journey is not toward a place, but toward a recognition. We do not move toward God as strangers. We move toward Him as children returning to a familiar embrace, tracing the curve of a path our spirit has walked before. Perhaps this is why certain moments in life feel eerily inevitable, as if they were waiting for us long before we could name them. A conversation that shifts the entire course of your life. A meeting that feels like the continuation of something ancient. A dream whose symbols you have never seen, yet somehow understand. These are ripples from that future memory, small flashes reminding us that the flow of the cosmos is circular, not linear. The past does not vanish, and the future is not unborn. Both are simply different ways eternity breathes. When the soul remembers forward, it does so not through logic, but through resonance. It recognizes vibrations, echoes, and patterns that the mind cannot yet chart. This is why prophecy, in its truest form, is not about prediction. It is about recognition. The prophets and visionaries across the ages did not see a mechanical sequence of events. They attuned themselves to the underlying music of the universe, and from that harmony, they knew where the melody was headed. They were listening to a song they had heard before, even if the verses had not yet been sung on earth. In the view of Urantia, the Father's plan for each soul is not a set of commands written on an unalterable scroll. It is a living design, responsive, breathing, yet always oriented toward one unshakable truth: the eventual reunion between Creator and creation. In that sense, the end is known, but the dance of how we arrive, there is ours to improvise. This is the paradox of destiny and free will. The destination is remembered, but the path is discovered step by step. The Sufi poets understood this paradox as the veil of love, a mystery in which the beloved hides his face so that we may have the joy of seeking it, even as he stands just behind the curtain, smiling. When we begin to sense the future as memory, life changes in quiet but radical ways. Anxiety loses some of its grip because the soul already knows there is nothing truly alien ahead, only more of itself unfolding. Hope ceases to be a blind wish and becomes an act of alignment, a tuning of the heart to the frequency of what is already real in spirit. Even the moments of pain and uncertainty begin to feel like corridors, not walls. And if we listen closely enough, we might hear the subtle footsteps of that future self approaching, bringing with it the wisdom, the peace, and the fullness we thought could only arrive someday, but which have been with us all along. It is in these moments of deep recognition that time loosens its grip and eternity seeps into the edges of our days. We may be sitting in a quiet room or walking along a nameless path at dusk, when suddenly a wave of knowing washes over us, a vision not of images but of essence. We realize that the self we long to become is not ahead of us, but intertwined with us now, whispering through our instincts, shaping our intuitions, leaving breadcrumbs in the form of synchronicities. The mystics have always called this the return before the arrival, where the traveler finds that the homecoming was hidden inside every step. Teilhard de Chardin spoke of the omega point, a convergence in which all creation awakens into unity with its source. In Urantia's vision, this is not merely the destiny of humanity, but of worlds, systems, and universes, the whole cosmic fabric turning inward toward the heart of the infinite. And yet, the journey is intimate. The vastness does not diminish the personal. Rather, it magnifies it, reminding us that the same thread weaving galaxies together is the one pulling us toward our own wholeness. So we stand here between the memory of what we were and the memory of what we will be, learning to walk as though both are true. And perhaps that is the truest act of faith, to live today as if tomorrow is already redeemed, to speak words that harmonize with the chorus we have not yet joined, to love as if we have already reached the end of all separations. For when the soul walks this way, the future ceases to be an unknown territory. It becomes what it has always been, a home we have not yet finished remembering. Epilogue. You are the lost word, spoken again. There comes a moment, after the last page of every great journey, when silence speaks louder than any revelation. It is the silence of a soul that has walked through the ruins of forgotten cities and the corridors of stars, only to arrive at the threshold of its own heart. And there, in the stillness, the truth appears, not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper older than the world. You are the word I spoke before the beginning. The galaxies were strung like pearls for you to walk beneath, the seas carved deep so you would learn to listen to the undercurrents, the night adorned with fire so you would not forget the light. The sages have called it many things, logos, the breath, the hidden name, but it has always been the same truth folded into different languages. You were never cast into time by accident. You are a syllable of the eternal sentence, a note in the divine poem that will never be written twice. Even your longing to return to something greater is proof that you never truly left it. Like a wave that remembers the shore even as it drifts far out into the deep, your essence carries the coordinates of home. And so the great journey turns inward. It is not the return to a place, but to a presence. In Urantia's vision, the source is not a distant monarch seated on a throne of untouchable light, but the very heartbeat that has pulsed through every moment of your existence. Rumi said, "You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop." The Gospel of John began with, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Now you know that the Word is not only with God. It is you, remembered, spoken again into the unfolding fabric of eternity. To understand this is to see that nothing in your life has been wasted. Not the storms that shattered you. Not the nights when prayer felt like throwing stones into a bottomless well. Not even the detours that seem to take you away from everything sacred. Every fragment has been a syllable, every season a breath, every encounter a brushstroke in the sentence your soul was meant to speak. The pain you carried was not the silence of abandonment, but the pause between words, the sacred inhale before the next line of the poem. The prophets knew this. They did not merely tell us what would come. They reminded us of what we already were. In their eyes, the end of the journey was not an apocalypse of destruction, but a revelation of recognition. The moment you finally hear your own voice in the voice of God. The mystics called it remembering, but it is more than memory. It is the awareness that the universe has been speaking you into being since before the first atom ignited, and will keep speaking you long after the stars themselves burn to ash. And so you stand at the meeting point of eternity and time, not as a spectator, but as the bridge itself. The lost word was never lost. It was hidden in the folds of your being until you were ready to hear it without fear. And now, the echo is clear. You're not a pilgrim searching for a temple. You are the temple. You are not a seeker in search of the divine. You are the place where the divine chooses to dwell. The ladder you climbed was never reaching upward to heaven. It was descending into the sanctum of your own soul. The journey was never about reaching a distant light, but about realizing that the light had been carrying you all along. You have been the question and the answer, the exile and the homecoming, the silence and the song. The Father's voice was not in the thunder that split the sky, nor in the fire that scorched the mountains, but in the still, unshakable whisper within you. the one that says, "You are mine. You always were, and now." The river of time curves gently back toward its source, and you find that the current is not pulling you away from life, but drawing you deeper into it. The cosmos is not a foreign expanse to be conquered. It is the mirror in which you finally see your own reflection without distortion. All that is left is to walk forward without fear, carrying the unspoken knowledge that you are here as living proof that the divine never forgets its own creation. So let this be your final remembrance. You are the living word, once thought lost, spoken again into the fabric of existence. You were born not merely to witness the revelation, but to be it. Every breath you take, every act of kindness, every moment of courage is the Creator speaking through you, a sentence still unfolding, a truth still being told. And when you one day return fully to the embrace from which you came, you will see that you were never merely part of the story. You were the story. You still are, and you always will be.